Welcome to Women in B2B Marketing, a show where CMOs, VPs of marketing, and all strong women leaders in B2B discuss their top tactics, strategies, and tips for building high-performing teams, leveraging trends, and ultimately rocking their marketing careers. Made by and for women, insightful for all. I'm your host and 15-year B2B marketer, Jane Serra. Let's dive in. Okay, welcome everybody to a new episode of Women in B2B Marketing. I know it has been a while since we had a new episode because life has been lifing. So glad to have you back. And we have an amazing guest joining us today, Naomi Nuta, who is the Vice President of Marketing at AptEdge, which we'll hear a little bit about. And she has the coolest background, 20 plus years in various go-to-market positions, which we'll also hear about. And she has a really strong background in research and neuroscience. So we're going to get into that side of things too. I'm excited to explore. But welcome to the show, Naomi. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jane. I'm really excited to be here. I feel very flattered to be among some of the women that you've interviewed before, because I've learned a ton from listening to the show as well.
Yay, we've had some great guests for sure, including yourself. So excited to continue to be enlightened, and everyone connect with Naomi on LinkedIn, and we'll go from there. But as most people know, we typically start out the show, and it'll be really interesting with you, Naomi. How did you get into the world of B2B marketing? What did your career path look like getting you into your current role today?
Sure. I think I'm one of those people who has an extremely indirect path and a liberal arts graduate. So liberal arts meant I studied nothing to do with marketing. I studied political science in college, and I was really interested in politics. And after college and graduate school, I ended up working for Mayor Mike Bloomberg's office in New York City. So now you've dated me, but I worked in his press office. And so I got exposed to just everything about what it means to run a city and the collegiate atmosphere of people working together towards a common goal. And then most importantly, data and how you communicate data and messaging. So that was my first still exposure. And after working for the mayor, I transitioned to a market research firm, which at the time, did polling. And the kind of secret, unsexy part of political polling is that it's an 80-20 rule. You make 80% of your business not from polling, but you talk about polling 80% of the time. And so while we were working on any political campaigns, I ended up working on consumer research, asking people questions about why they bought what they bought, testing messages, talking about brands, and just exposing myself to all of those types of surveys and crisis communications. When the New York City hockey team went on strike, the entire hockey league went on strike, the NHL, we discussed about the negotiations because our CEO at the time was a huge hockey fan. So we did that when the Dixie Chicks sang. They were sponsored by Lipton, but then they got into some political turmoil. We did both. So all of those were just really fun ways of understanding the impact of what's going on in the world relative to how we talk about things that we care about. So after going into that market research work, I took a break, I did some nonprofit work, and then eventually I transitioned into my second favorite activity, which was watching TV. And watching TV for market research purposes. And that was the consumer neuroscience piece of it. Consumer neuroscience in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, was becoming really popular because essentially they were using techniques that had previously just been for research and applying them to advertising. And so we looked at things like facial coding, we looked at things like eye tracking, we looked at things like galvanic skin response, which is really just how excited your skin is about what it's doing. Sometimes it's goosebumps, but reality, it's really, we have electricity in our systems, in our physiology, neurons and so forth are firing, right? Neurons are firing. You have electricity, and it can be measured through your skin glands, through the oil in your skin. So all of those were literally, but to your point, goosebumps, it was literally just physical. How much detail can we get about how we're physically reacting to something that we're engaged in, whether it's watching TV or watching, at the time we still had TV ads, so watching ads, or as it became watching ads on different mediums and different platforms like social platforms. That included also EEG. So what are the electrical systems going on in our brains and what are those telling us about what we watch? So that became just a really huge exposure to everything about how humans make decisions, how our emotional systems, not so much our feelings, but literally those electrical signals in our bodies influence the decisions that we make. To apply some of these tools to watching telenovelas, to testing ads, to doing some sales advertising for media companies so that I get sponsorship with different TV shows and figuring out how to make those sponsorships better, to package design work. So everything and anything that could influence all of the marketing that was going out to consumers. And we ended up being acquired by Nielsen, which was the huge TV ratings agency and shopping agency. And so by doing that, we were exposed to even more opportunities to understand how people make decisions ultimately. And so that was a really interesting piece. But ultimately, it was agency work. And at the time, I decided, you know what? I've been researching everybody else for so long. I've been influencing and making recommendations, but I've never actually been on the action side. Is once you have these recommendations, what do you do with them? Do you actually edit your ad? Do you make different decisions? And so I really wanted to transition and work for an organization that was taking advantage of how people think, how people make decisions, how people change, and also work for that organization to help them improve everything that they were doing. And so ultimately that brought me to Cogito. And Cogito was first of its kind machine learning, early AI. So what everyone faces today is AI. Cogito had started working in this space years ago, and they were building tools that would coach contact center agents to have better conversations. So it was provided in real time. You call in, you're calling a customer service agent, and you may be upset. Usually the customer is upset or has some kind of problem.
They're calling in. Yeah.
Right. And then the agent is tasked with not only solving the problem, but showing empathy while they solve the problem, or at least trying to solve the problem to the best of their ability. And so our technology was able to provide nudges to the agent to remind them how different tactics and techniques that they could use to improve upon the conversation. And then it also generated, which we've now seen from all different tools in AI, just tons and tons of data that allowed us to predict more effectively what the customer experience would be after going through this experience, rather than taking a survey after they get off the phone and all the other thoughts and variables that might influence those opinions. We could measure their experience in the moment while they were on the call.
Oh, cool.
So that's really exciting and different. And it exposed me to technology, to the technology space. And it also exposed me to B2B and how you go to market in a B2B organization. And so when I left Cogito and transitioned to AptEdge, that was basically taking it one step further and almost on speed. Is now, how do we sell and go to market with AI technology to people who also already build and or use AI themselves in the customer support space? So like essentially for these layers of over and over, as I evolved in learning about how people make decisions, it's the context of where those decisions might be made is different. The atmosphere under which those decisions are made might be different. But ultimately, it's all rooted in the same human to human contact. And what does that mean to help another human with, in this case, technology? The long story.
I love this. I feel like we could have a dedicated show. Maybe this is a show idea for you one day, just on the research component, because as you were talking through that, I just came up with so many different things I wanted to ask you without it, but I don't want to interrupt your story. But if you don't mind me rewinding a little bit, I'm curious, from this path, right, and the time when you were involved in market research and identifying, right, like tracking skin reaction, facial cues, all of these things. I have two questions. One, did you take any of that insight and what you used to monitor into what you're doing today or into B2B marketing world? And how do you apply that now?
Sure. I think that there's some very basic and this is me actually not having an academic background in neuroscience or the brain or how we think, and really just catching up with reading and with exposure to the experts as I did this work more and more. And one of the things that my first boss told me when I worked in consumer neuroscience was that, and he would repeat this over and over again, but context matters. So essentially, the boil down is whatever you're trying to communicate, the person on the receiving end will not accept it if you're not communicating in the language, in the tone, in the pace, in the pitch, and in the visuals that they understand. So I take that everywhere, whether I'm selling to a soccer mom, and no, I'm a soccer mom. That's why I'm called. If I'm selling to a soccer mom, and what is it I'm selling? Am I selling some consumer packaged good like Tylenol or a car? The message is going to be different. And so when I take that to technology and B2B, my starting point is always, who's the person I'm talking to? Who's the person I'm selling to? What are all their problems and their issues and their decision-making pathways? And only at the very end do I get to, well, what is it I'm actually selling? And what are the product features and benefits and things like that? So I know that, and sacrilege, I work for a product company, but I always start with our audience as opposed to product. And I learned from day zero of asking people questions.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I feel like I haven't seen this. If any listeners, and maybe Naomi, if there's anybody out there who does the similar like consumer research that you were a part of conducting and analyzing and sharing for B2B buyers, that would be fascinating to me. Have you seen that?
Yeah. And I'm blanking on the names, but there are a bunch of consultancies out there, behavioral science consultancies, and they do work with the organizations. I think it depends on the size. And oftentimes the question that they're trying to solve is not necessarily how do you go to market better, but it's more narrow. So if you talk to product marketers in particular, they probably have a very good sense of how people tick, because that's essentially the work of a product marketer, is understand the context, understand the market you're in, understand your competitors, understand what you're trying to achieve, and understand your product, yes, and then how do you communicate within that? So I would assume, I'm happy to look into it, but I do think that there's probably a few behavioral science consultants out there.
Yeah. It would just be so cool to be able to see behind the scenes of what B2B buyers, like what our reactions are when we're being pitched something or when we're on a website, right? Like beyond, I know that eye tracking, there's things you could do on the website, but I'm curious, like the actual, like the skin reaction to different things would be such another level.
It's interesting you say that, because when I first started working in B2B, having come from Nielsen and having done so much consumer work, I automatically went into it assuming that, well, these are humans. So therefore, humans are consumers, whether it's B2B or B2C, theoretically, it should be all the same. Now, I have since learned that many marketers think that's sacrilege and you should never assume that. And B2B buyers are totally different from B2C buyers. But the more I see it, yes, they're not exactly the same, but a consumer who's buying a significant item, like a car, they're going to use many parts of their decision-making process in making that decision. They will use the emotional centers of their brain, because those are the centers that are going to remember what attracted them to that car in the first place. Maybe it's color, maybe it's the history of the brand, like Mercedes or what have you.
Maybe Jaguar. That's in the news right now.
So maybe it's the feeling that they get when they think of that brand. And then the rational side or conscious side of the brain is going to think more about how much does this cost me? How much can I afford? Will it fit my kids? Will they destroy it because they're so messy? Therefore, it makes no sense to buy such a nice car. All of those are elements that in a significant decision, a consumer will make. I think when we look at B2B, it's very similar because you are looking at tools and more with PLG motions. We're looking and trying out tools on our own before we're ever sold to at the enterprise level. We're going to explore, engage, play around with, see what we can do with it. And usually it's born out of this, I've got a problem right now. Like literally before I got on the call with you, I needed to figure out how to use interactive demo software. And we have one that we're using, so I won't name names, but that one was hard for me. It felt like it was better for our product manager. And I heard a different podcast on a different tool. And I was like, oh, I'll just try that one. And it worked really easily for me, which made me. So the experience of using something, I think, is a little bit different from B2C to B2B buyers. But all of my emotional kind of instinctual reactions are probably the same of how I felt after using this alternative tool would be the same as how I feel at home after solving some kind of problem and using whatever it was as a consumer, buying a new car and being able to actually drive to the places I want to drive. It's ultimately down when the reward centers of the brain, it's the same reward. It's just this minimalist. So hopefully I'm not irritating all of the other marketers who believe they're very different mindsets.
No, this is so exciting for me. I love this kind of stuff. I need to take a course and get back into learning all the psychology behind marketing, a refresher, and probably some things have changed. Definitely a lot of things have changed. So it'd be cool to see even you just mentioning it triggers a reward system like that lights up in the brain. So that remembering for PLG especially, right? But inside the product, the user experience, remembering to give those little rewards and in your onboarding experiences for marketing, there's so many touch points where you can activate that.
Yeah, I think that the biggest difference, the other difference in B2B that I've seen is that B2B marketers are very good at taking these basic fundamental truths about human nature and scaling them. I think that is a really big difference because with all of the technology that we have available, not only can we scale, but we can scale to more kind of minute segments of our population. And that's much easier than, say, advertisers who really only had one budget. They only had one ad they could make. And then, maybe they could choose where they advertised and who they targeted. And that's gotten easier over time. But it's still very hard to do that at the snap of a finger. And I think the benefit for B2B marketers who are really good at this is they can understand that context. They can understand who it is they're marketing to, and then they can activate it because they know they're marketing to more than just one individual, to the hundreds and thousands that they're trying to reach.
So you mentioned fundamental truths of human nature, which I feel like that should be a book that you write in the future applied to B2B marketing. But that... I could be your agent, Naomi. I feel like I have all these ideas for you. But speaking of the fundamental truths, are there any that you observed or realized during your research side and networking at Nielsen and your entire background that you take into B2B marketing? Like any fundamental truths that are your foundational and you just know to...
So there's it really depends on where, but there's one kind of layer in when I worked at Cogito, we talked a lot about this concept of person perception or interpersonal sensitivity, which is really about how you convey a message. And there's a very famous quote by Maya Angelou, which a lot of people cite, which talks about that people won't remember what you said, but I'm butchering the quote, so this is not exactly. But they won't remember what you said, but they remember how you said it. And the reason is how you receive information often, always, I think, affects how you make a decision following that and how you feel about who gave you the information. And so tone, pitch, pace, whether it's your voice or it's your text or your copy or your visual, all of those become, I think, more critical than the copy themselves. And having said that, I do think it's very important to think about the words that you choose. But that's why with AI and with large language models, for example, nowadays, you can direct the large language model to give you content in a specific tone, in a specific approach, in a friendly way, in an informal way. Like, those matter because how you read it, I'm going to think differently. My husband always writes exclamation points on all of his text messages. You'll see. Always, oh my God, is this an exciting thing or not? And that I react in some way, even though I know who it is who sent it to me. But imagine that you're doing marketing to people you don't know, you've never met. You're imagining how you want them to feel when they read or hear or see your creative and your messaging. And the goal is that how you imagine is the reality, is how they feel. So it's probably the most important that I took away from it.
Yeah, I love that. And a great quote from Maya Angelou. I remember that, like the how you make them feel lingers. And yes, it's such a good point and great reminder. I don't know if I've ever bridged that quote to marketing. And that's so important. I think it can apply everywhere, like universally, right? Where person to person, day-to-day interactions, internal teams, just that's such an important part of how you're remembered.
Very much.
Very cool. This, we've touched on it, but I'm curious. I know you've written about this a little bit and commented on LinkedIn about the emotional context of decision making. Like we're talking about the how you make them feel. Can you unpack this a little bit? Like for context, how, if you are building a campaign, where do you begin? Do you sit with your team? If you had a team saying, this is how we want them to feel, these are the results, how do we get them there? What's your process with that in mind?
That's a great question. I'll think about my company, AptEdge, is a startup technology company. And we are building a solution that's designed to help customer support engineers and customer support teams essentially solve cases faster by giving them the resources that they need and giving them access to the information they need. So when we are thinking about a campaign, first, I do start with my goal. What is it that I want to achieve, maybe financially and metric-wise, but more importantly, what do I want and who's my target audience, and what do I want them to feel when they see my copy or what have you in the campaign? And it's a couple of things, because first, we're at a stage at my company where we need to attract attention. So we're really in the brand building phase. And from a brand perspective, that's where the emotional parts of the brain are really important, because a brand is something that's memorable. A brand is an idea. A brand is ultimately the idea, that the imagination that you create. Sometimes it's called like imagination of the mind. It's when you give me the brand, I think about everything that's associated and how I'm supposed to feel with that brand. And for consumers, it's a very easy thing to understand. But I think it still applies in B2B as well. When I'm thinking about a campaign, I'm thinking about the AptEdge brand and what is it that we want to communicate and how are we going to do that? So there's that piece. And then it also applies to the assets that we want to create and the level of information that we're sharing, and also in what venue or vehicle that we're communicating. A LinkedIn post, for example, we think about what's going to attract attention to LinkedIn posts. And there's a lot of research out there about kind of imagery and emojis or not emojis, but ultimately what's going to attract attention. And then within the copy, what's going to get them to click. So those are two very different things. And I have to think about both of those components. Whereas if the asset is an ad, what kind of ad, what format, where is it going to be? And what are my trade-offs? Obviously, there's going to be budget limitations in all of this campaign glory that I wish I could spend tons of money on. And so I have to think about where I can make efficiencies relative to the venue and the vehicle that I'm using to communicate the message. Sometimes you decide, you know what? We're going to put a lot more emphasis on our free content, on our blog, on our white paper, and we're going to make that as best as we humanly can. And then we're going to put minimal emphasis on our ads. But we know that when they do read the copy, that's much more likely to get them to want to reach out and engage us. So I think I apply it in those kind of, it sounds like it's not process oriented at all, because it's like, in the process of creating a campaign, you essentially have to have that in the back of your mind, and you ask yourself this question: why does this matter? What's the why? What's the why throughout the entire process?
Yeah. It seems like it's being very obviously intentional and thoughtful behind every step, right? And just asking yourself about not just what's your goal and reminding yourself of that, but how do you want them to feel? Because that, if you achieve that, you'll achieve your goal if all works out.
Exactly right. Especially when you're in that brand building stage, the how you want them to feel is probably the most important element of all of this, especially with technology, where a lot of the technology starts to sound the same and starts to feel the same. What else can I do to somehow create a relationship with my buyer without, and this is the really cool trick that expert marketers can do in B2B. It's that, how do I create a relationship with my buyer who I've never met, but do it at scale repeatedly and repeatedly, and in a way that they know their buyer just as well as their most successful salesperson knows the account owner and the actual human champion who has bought the product. I think it's a really very impressive how so many people can achieve that.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the human side of the buyers and marketing journey and how we tap into that. I'm curious, I think I saw you write about this on LinkedIn. I was doing a little stalking. The human side of Gen AI. Can you get into that a little bit? I use similar language at Daxtra because it's all about, we leverage AI as well, but for recruiters, so that they could focus on the human side of recruiting, again, the actual relationship building. But I'm curious what your take is on the human side of AI. What does this mean?
For me, a lot of this started with the AI that I was working with previous to AptEdge, because I had to spend, before the word AI was on everyone's tongue, it was more a little bit esoteric. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how someone who is being told they're using technology, and they're, especially in our case, using technology to guide and change their behavior, we had to understand what would get them to be excited about using something like this. Obviously, the outcomes mattered, but also just as important is what was used to create these models, what information was used to guide their decisions and to guide their behavior. And in that case, the human element was really important, because essentially we were using conversations. We were using conversations between humans so that we could study them and create and train models that would mimic guidance in a human conversation, mimic this question of interpersonal sensitivity to ensure that it would activate at the right time. So that became really important, is if you're going to use AI to guide human behavior, you better use humans to build those AI models and systems.
Yeah.
And then you also need to think about the fact that humans are different. And so we spend a lot of time talking about bias. And I know it's not everywhere in the news anymore, but I think bias is still really important, because the people who are designing the models, the people who are choosing the data that's going to be used in these models, they have to think about whether it's representative of an entire group. For example, in flipping it to the contacts or to the customer support worlds, particularly in B2B, when we are training models, we have to think about what is the kind of data that a customer support agent needs, the data of their product, the data that documents how their product works, the processes and systems and workflows that the individual enterprise has designed to be more effective. So AI has to reflect that. And so I think bias is still really important. And then the final piece is what's often referred to as the human in the loop. Say you trained your model, say you ran it through a whole bunch of tests and it passed all the fairness and equity tests, and it's much better than random, and it's doing all the things that the model is supposed to be doing. They're still putting it into play in the real world and getting people to give you feedback. And that thumbs up or thumbs down, this was the right answer, this was the wrong answer, are so critical to essentially going back and retraining and improving these models. Because the thing that we've all seen now that we all have access to AI more regularly is that we can see how quickly the information can become stale if it's not consistently updated and iterated on. And it's essentially, it's saying to the user, you have a responsibility too. We created this technology, but it's your responsibility to use it enough and give us the feedback so that we can make it better for you and the next person who uses it after you. So
that's such a good point. Do you also think on the AI side that there's a need? So if you are an AI software or an AI vendor, and do you think, if you are using AI at all, which most of us are at this point in some way, shape, or form, do you think that it's important for a human to also check on things from time to time, almost like human QA? So not just the thumbs up, thumbs down, but there's also like, I know there's one example Casey Jenkins gave in Sendoso, like they set up a whole outbound SDR with AI, but they saw like some things that were one-off that shouldn't be happening. So they scaled back and they kept iterating and learning from that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. The coolest part about so many people using AI now is, and this goes way back to the market research side of things, is people are much more comfortable experimenting just because you have to. Just by deciding that you're going to use AI in your day-to-day work and you're going to expose it to your customers, you're basically saying, I am experimenting with this technology. Usually it's very accurate, but there's a chance that it sometimes will give you information that's inaccurate. And therefore, you have to be okay with that. So both the buyer and the seller are becoming much more comfortable with, ironically, human error, even though it's not humans that are committing the errors. And I just think it's fascinating because I go all the way back to when we were doing eye tracking research, and the NF was experimenting with split screens so that they could keep the game going, but they would also have an ad. So for the audience, because they needed the ads, obviously, to fund the games. And we were doing studies. So we know, first of all, when you split a screen or you split a visual, essentially you're literally telling the person to look in two different directions. And therefore, their brain has a much harder time processing the information. And the likelihood that they remember what they saw on the screen is that much lower. So advertisers of having a split screen and the risk to the NFL was more of a risk to the advertisers, because if you're having the game on and you're having your ad, are they going to remember that the KFC chicken is as good as you made it taste, as you made it sound? And so the reality was we did eye tracking to show where people's eyes are while these ads and these games are going on. And we did find that over 75% of people would still watch the ad, particularly the tagline and stuff. But for the advertisers, 75 was really horrible because they couldn't, the amount that they pay for these ads and the amount they pay to show them during the NFL games is so much that even 25% of people not seeing them was too big of a risk. And so they were just like, no, we're not going to do it. Whereas now we're being told there are hallucinations in large language models. We're getting more and more comfortable with hallucinations. We're more and more comfortable kind of identifying when a hallucination occurs, that we have expectations that accuracy is 90%, 91%, 92%. And we're really happy with that because that's way better than a human might have made an error or something else might have made an error earlier. So our flexibility and our comfort level, I think, has gotten a lot better than the old world of advertising, for example.
Oh, such a good example. That's amazing. It also makes me think, as I'm not a huge sports watcher, though my husband is, so it's always on the background. But similarly on the Today Show, in the mornings, they always do like a split screen where it's your weather is coming in 30 seconds and they have an ad, but it's showing you all this other stuff on the side. And I'm always like, I don't know where to look. I'd be curious to see the stats on that. It's probably similar.
Exactly. That's why YouTube doesn't let you skip the ad until at least 5 seconds. Darn, that's this whole thing. It's got to be worth it.
Yeah. I know that we are about at time. I wanted to ask you one last question. If you could go back 20 years ago, Naomi, just starting out in your career path, what would you say to your younger self?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think it's probably the same thing I still say to myself, which is don't take everything so seriously. Yeah. When you're starting out and you're really eager and you want to be perfect and you want to do really well, I think no matter what stage in your career, if that was the personality you had then, probably I definitely still have that personality now, and I want to be the best and regardless of what it is I'm doing. So I would say that. And then from a kind of career path trajectory, I would probably caution myself to be a little bit more targeted about what I was doing and the decisions I was making. I think when you start out, it seems so new. But I do think today people have more exposure to careers and different types of roles and professions than they may ever have before. I came from the world where you looked for jobs in the big binder in the career center.
Yeah.
The way that we get exposed to roles, there were roles I'd never heard of that exist now and roles that have evolved. And so I would just say, pay attention to what's out there, but also just follow along and take a pause before you make any of those decisions.
Pause is always such a good lesson. That's what I would go back and tell my younger self too. Pause. In every sense of the word. I love that. Thank you so much, Naomi. You've opened my eyes to so many things that I just want to go back and rethink. I'm definitely going to ask myself more now whenever I'm creating a campaign or a new strategy. How do we want them to feel? I feel like we're great at doing that on an internal, what is our brand mission? And it's like that kind of internal team stuff. But for marketing, I think I'm just like, what do we want them to do? We want them to click. We want them to buy. So how do we want to make them feel? I'm going to incorporate it. And so thank you for your insight today.
No problem. No, it's just a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to hearing from all the experts after this as well.
Yeah. Yay. And for those of the listeners who want to connect with you, is LinkedIn the best place to find and to do? Perfect. Yeah. I'll put links in the show notes, everybody. But remember, if you love the episode, give us a rating, 5 stars if you think it deserves it. Just be honest and give us a nice little comment review. I think you can comment in Spotify now and share with a friend to share the love. But thank you for listening. And thank you again, Naomi, for joining today.
Thank you. It was great, Jane. Great to meet you.
Likewise.